Like all of slavery, the Christmas experience, though always a part of a traumatic and evil system, varied from location to location, master by master. There are accounts of single days off, 2 days off, 3 to 5 days, and even 2 weeks. One extreme and rare permission allowed the enslaved of a certain section of Missouri to have 5 weeks off for Christmas. Recalled an enslaved person, we could come and go as much as we pleased and go for miles as we wanted to, but we had better be back by the 1st of February. And that's another thing. Some enslaved were allowed to travel during their Christmas time off, whether that meant going to visit family on another plantation, going to get married as marriage rates increased during this period of the year, or going to earn some money. That's right, some enterprising enslaved people used the time to capitalize on their labor, as it was believed by their enslavers that any money earned by a person during the holidays was their own to keep. Wrote Fredrick Douglass in his autobiography, "The staid, sober, thinking, and industrious ones of our number would employ themselves in making corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets, and another class of us would spend the time in hunting opossums, hares, and coons." A man named Clayton Holbert, who worked on a plantation of 100 enslaved in Tennessee, said, "The slaves used to dance or go to the prayer meeting to pass their time. There were also festivals we went to during the Christmas vacation. There was always a big celebration on Christmas. We worked until Christmas Eve, and from that time until New Year's, we had a vacation. We had no such thing as Thanksgiving. We had never heard of such a thing." And there are some enslaved who recalled not getting a Christmas at all. But for the majority of the enslaved in the South, whether it was a day or 7 or more or less, the holiday season was a time of rest and relaxation. And when that got boring, partying. Wrote Douglass, "By far the larger part engaged in such sports and merriments as playing ball, wrestling, running foot races, fiddling, dancing, and drinking whiskey. And this latter mode of spending the time was by far the most agreeable to the feelings of our masters." The hearty drinking was for a number of reasons. It was well known that Southern whites drank to excess during the Christmas season, with diaries, letters, and newspapers revealing that even genteel white women and children were allowed to participate in leisurely drinking they were kept from for the rest of the year. Take this quote from a 19th century observer of Southern Christmas traditions. "Christmas is a general scene of dissipation and idleness. Some folks spent the time making rough jokes. Apprentice boys and little Negroes fired guns and crackers. And everyone, parents, children, servants, old, young, white, black, and yellow, drank hard." If you inquire, what is it all for? No earthly reason is assigned, except this: why, man? It is Christmas. Many slave owners also allowed the enslaved to drink, even though the rest of the year it was illegal to do so. In fact, several slave owners encouraged, if not downright forced, their captives to drink during the holiday season. Wrote Fredrick Douglass in his autobiography, "It was deemed a disgrace not to get drunk at Christmas." Douglass explained that he believed Christmas, and definitely the drinking portion of it, to be a tool of oppression in which people deprived of freedom and autonomy were overloaded with alcohol, degraded, made to be hungover, and then reminded by their masters that a master was needed to keep them from making poor choices. One man who escaped to freedom named Francis Fredrick backed this up, saying his enslaver would force his captives to drink for 4 to 5 days and then say, "Now you slaves, don't you see what bad use you have been making of your liberty?" John Smith of North Carolina, however, seemed to represent a portion of enslaved who either received watered down liquor or didn't drink to excess. He recalled, "My master give us Christmas. Sometimes he give us 2 weeks before we went to work again. We had plenty of liquor, but nobody got drunk." Of course, not all masters allowed drinking or even allowed dancing. A woman named Henrietta McCullers, who said she loved her master in North Carolina all her life, also said her enslaver didn't want her slaves to dance because she was such a good Christian. Showing even more diversity among the enslaved is the fact that there were some groups that outright refused drinking or dancing, instead opting to hold small religious ceremonies while their fellows gallivanted and indulged around them. One former enslaved woman named Susan Dabney Swedes recalled how an entire plantation in Mississippi stopped the tradition of dancing to banjos and fiddles after everyone converted to baptism. While some masters allowed this autonomy, others did not. Jacob Stroyer wrote, "A great many of the strict members of the church who did not dance at Christmas would be forced to do it to please their masters." One super rare Christmas time phenomenon took place in my home state of North Carolina, near the coastal area and in the Caribbean exclusively. John Canoe, or John Canas, or John Canoe, depending on various sources, involved young enslaved men dressing in costumes and going from house to house singing, beating drums, and dancing dancing in exchange for gifts. They were called cooners. Recalled Harriet Jacobs in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Every child rises on Christmas morning to see the John canoes. Without them, Christmas would be shorn of its greatest attraction. The origin of John canoe is mysterious, with roots in England and changes made by enslaved people from West Africa. Along with involving some male participants dressing up as women, it contained elements of those Christmas celebrations we discussed in the Middle Ages: rowdiness, public drunkenness, and lewdness. Coincidentally, the same types of celebrations taking place among the white population everywhere else. Wrote a woman in her diary in New Bern, North Carolina in 1858, "Christmas was celebrated here as usual. In the morning, the cooners were out. The streets were densely thronged with Negroes. This week will be a general stir-up among them, after which things will again resume a more quiet aspect." In the 1830s, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas became the first to declare Christmas a state holiday. For slaveholding states, Christmas was a tool to prevent rebellion or a way to keep the enslaved in line for the rest of the year. Wrote Douglass, "They do not give the slaves this time because they would not like to have their work during its continuance, but because they know it would be unsafe to deprive them of it." Christmas on the plantation, like the institution of slavery itself, was definitely paternalistic. And like paternalistic narratives about happy slave folk given shelter and food by their caring masters, Christmas reinforced the system itself. On one hand, masters could use the threat of withholding Christmas to make his or her enslaved people work harder, snitch on each other, or otherwise stay in line. Gifts were given to enslaved as a way to alleviate guilt, or simply lend credence to the notion of the benevolent slave owner who loved his slaves as if they were second-class members of the family. Wrote one Louisiana slave owner in 1836, "We had a right merry Christmas. I am much more reconciled to my condition as a slave owner when I see how cheerful and happy my fellow creatures can be in a state of servitude, how much I have it in my power to minister to their happiness." How about you set them free? Make them happy for real. Some enslaved played a game called Christmas Gift, where they would attempt to sneak up on their master and yell the phrase at them. If the enslaved said Christmas gift first, they would receive a gift. One woman even recalled she and her family sneaking into the big house to hide around the house to jump out of corners at their white owners. Some masters gave their enslaved money, possibly in a foolish attempt to appear charitable and fair-natured. Recalled a former South Carolina enslaved man, "Master always carried a roll of money as big as my arm. He would come up to the quarter on Christmas, July 4th, and Thanksgiving, and get up on a stump and call all the children out. Then he would throw money to them. At Christmas, he would throw $10 bills." This was, of course, very rare and could have possibly been the words of a brainwashed former enslaved person trying to make his master sound wealthy and kind to a listening WPA interviewer. Masters were more likely to give small gifts of sugar, tobacco, hats, ribbons, bandanas, and other trinkets. They provided liquor, as mentioned, but also luxury foods that weren't available for the rest of the year. Some enslaved remember how they never got meat except for on Christmas. For those of you who watched a buffet of Black food history, you know how underfed enslaved people often were, and therefore know the importance of receiving luxury food once a year to someone with little else to look forward to. Recalled one Georgia baker, "Oh, what a time us slaves did have on Christmas Day. Cake of all kinds, fresh meat, light bread, turkeys, chickens, ducks, geese, and all sorts of wild game. There was always plenty of pecans, apples, and dried peaches too." Eggnog, of course, notable for having the illicit whiskey, was also highly expensive, requiring eggs, fresh cream, and sugar. Some masters made a big show of preparing the beverage and giving a cup to each of their enslaved, in a similar role reversal to the Roman masters of Saturnalia who served their enslaved once a year. In the 16th century, the Spanish told their Jesuit inspectors to gift bundles of clothing to Peruvian enslaved people at Christmas, similar to English enslavers gifting their victims in Jamaica in the 18th century. Also illustrating the long-running power dynamic of the holidays, there were European landowners treating a few of their peasants once a year to find food and drink, as was customary during the Middle Ages. I mean, think about it. During some of those antebellum Christmas celebrations, field hands who were usually kept out of the big house were sometimes served food in them or called inside to receive a gift. Recalled one white woman in her journal in 1858, "Spent the day waiting on the Negroes and making them as comfortable as possible." I'm sure she felt quite good about herself, regardless of the horror she otherwise inflicted on them. Honey. Shady.